There's a map sitting in the Library of Congress right now. Abraham Ortelius, 1570. Tartariae Sive Magni Chami Regni Typus asterisk. Map of Tartaria or the Kingdom of the Great Cham. It shows an empire stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from Persia to the Arctic Circle. Detailed, specific, matter of fact, not mythical, not speculative. There, in Latin and careful cartographic notation, asserting the existence of something that, according to modern history textbooks, never quite existed at all. Except here's what they don't tell you in those same textbooks. This wasn't some isolated oddity. This wasn't one confused mapmaker with poor sources. For nearly 3 centuries, from the 1500s through the 1800s, Tartaria appeared on virtually every major map of Asia produced by the finest cartographers of Europe. Mercator showed it in 1630. Nicolas Visscher's 1657 new and accurate map of all Asia gave Tartaria pride of place across the northern expanse. Guillaume de L'Isle, the first asterisk premier Géographe du Roi asterisk of France, mapped Great Tartary in exquisite detail in the early 1700s. And then something happened, something coordinated, something that, once you see it, changes how you understand the very architecture of historical knowledge itself. The maps were rewritten, not updated, not refined, rewritten, and with them an empire vanished. Let me be clear about what I'm saying. I'm not claiming Tartaria was some advanced technological civilization with free energy and mud floods. Leave that noise for the internet forums. What I'm saying is simpler, and in some ways, more disturbing. An enormous geographic and political entity that existed on official maps for 300 years disappeared from those same maps within a narrow historical window. And the mechanisms that accomplished this disappearance reveal a pattern of knowledge control so sophisticated that most people navigating within it can't see it at all. This investigation began with a simple question, not about buildings, not about technology, a question about maps. Why did the term Tartary appear so consistently, so prominently across centuries of European cartography, only to evaporate almost completely by the late 1800s? And why, when I asked contemporary historians this question, did their answers sound like they'd been pulled from the same script? Here's what they told me, almost verbatim, whether they were teaching in Edinburgh, Moscow, or Berkeley. Tartary was merely a vague geographic term European cartographers used for regions they didn't understand well. As geographic knowledge improved, the term became obsolete and was replaced by more specific designations like Siberia, Mongolia, and Manchuria. Reasonable, except it doesn't explain the evidence. When Abraham Ortelius created his groundbreaking World Atlas Theatrum Orbis Terrarum in 1570, he didn't include Tartaria as background fill for unknown territories. He gave it a dedicated map. The area labeled extended with remarkable specificity from the Volga River and Caspian Sea westward to the Pacific eastward, from Persia and India southward to the Arctic Ocean northward. The map included notes about the Magno Chamo, the Great Khan described as the highest ruler of Asia. It referenced Christian kingdoms that had once existed there under Prester John, mentioned political structures, trade routes, diplomatic relations. This wasn't vagueness, this was documentation. And it wasn't just Ortelius. Jodocus Hondius incorporated detailed maps of Tartary into his editions of Mercator's Atlas from 1606 onwards, showing the Great Wall of China, Nova Zembla, geographical features with consistency that suggests actual knowledge, not speculation. The 1620 Hondius map includes numerous towns, cities, lakes, rivers, mountains, the kind of detail that emerges from compilation of travel accounts, diplomatic missions, merchant reports. The mundane machinery of geographic knowledge. By the 18th century, maps became even more refined. The 1771 edition of Encyclopaedia Britannica shows Grand Tartary extending from the Mediterranean clear across to what could reasonably be identified as the Alaskan coast. not as a vague blob of terra incognita, but subdivided into regions: Western Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary, independent Tartary, each with boundaries, each implying some level of political organization. The capital of Muscovite Tartary, Tobolsk in Siberia. Now here's where it gets interesting. That 1771 Britannica entry wasn't brief. It wasn't dismissive. Tartary received substantial treatment as a geographic and political reality, but by the late 1800s, the entry had shrunk. By the 1911 edition, Tartary had transformed into Tatars, a discussion of ethnic peoples, remnants of Mongol invasions, but no longer an empire or even a coherent geographic designation. The Russian Geographical Society eventually produced a gentle explanation. These were simply Turkic peoples scattered across Central Asia and Siberia, never a unified political entity, just a European misnomer applied to lands they didn't understand. The official story is tidy. As European knowledge improved through exploration and Russian expansion, the crude label Tartary was replaced by accurate geographic and political designations. Progress, enlightenment, the natural evolution of knowledge. Except the evolution wasn't natural, it was surgical, and it happened across multiple institutions, multiple countries, multiple competing intellectual traditions, all within the same narrow time window. That's not evolution, that's coordination. Let me show you what I mean. Pick any major encyclopedia or geographic reference work from the early to mid-1700s. French, English, German, Dutch, they all show Tartary extensively. Then track those same publications into the 1800s. The coverage shrinks, the terminology shifts, the political implications evaporate. By 1900, Tartary has become a quaint historical curiosity, a term ignorant Europeans once used for lands they didn't comprehend, nothing more. This transformation required more than just better exploration. It required editorial coordination, and editorial coordination requires infrastructure. So I started looking at that infrastructure. Who published the maps? Who funded the expeditions that supposedly corrected earlier errors? Who sat on the editorial boards of the encyclopedias and geographic societies that decided what knowledge was authoritative? And that's when the names started appearing. Names that had nothing to do with geography or cartography, banking families, industrial magnates, the same networks of financial power that were, during this exact period, consolidating control over currencies, funding both sides of wars, establishing the modern architecture of global finance. The Rothschilds funded archaeological expeditions throughout Central Asia in the 1800s, the same period when Tartary was disappearing from maps. They endowed university chairs in history, anthropology, and geography, the disciplines that would go on to define how we understand Asia's past. They established foundations that funded the publication of geographic encyclopedias, the training of cartographers, the standardization of geographic nomenclature. Not alone, of course. Other banking dynasties participated. Industrial families whose fortunes depended on resource extraction in precisely the regions once labeled Tartary. Rockefeller money funded Asian studies programs at major universities. Carnegie Wealth established libraries and research institutions that determined which historical sources would be preserved, which would be accessible, which interpretations would be taught. Why would bankers care about cartography? The official answer: civic responsibility, philanthropy, advancing human knowledge. But when you trace the actual outcomes of their funding, a different pattern emerges. They didn't fund research that expanded historical understanding. They funded research that narrowed it. They didn't preserve diverse historical sources. They centralized control over which sources mattered. They didn't encourage questioning of approved narratives. They built institutions that punished deviation. Think about what happens when the same financial network funds universities, publishing houses, geographic societies, and archaeological expeditions simultaneously. They don't need to issue explicit directives about what conclusions are acceptable. The structure itself ensures compliance. Researchers learn which interpretations get funded. Publishers learn which books sell to the institutions these families endow. Academic departments learn which methodologies lead to tenure and which lead to professional isolation. The system becomes self-enforcing, and anyone operating within it becomes invested in defending it because questioning it threatens their career, their reputation, their sense of intellectual legitimacy. This is why, when I contacted academic historians specializing in Central Asian history and asked simple questions about Tartary, their responses were so remarkably uniform. They weren't lying. They genuinely believed their explanations. The system had trained them so effectively that they couldn't see the contradictions in their own answers. Tartary was just a vague geographic term, they told me. But when I pointed to the specific political structures, capital cities, and diplomatic references in 17th and 18th century sources, they became defensive. When I asked why all major encyclopedias revised their Tartary entries in the same direction during the same period, they suggested I was pursuing conspiracy theories. When I inquired about the funding sources for the geographic research that supposedly corrected earlier errors, they recommended I stick to reputable sources, meaning sources that supported the approved narrative. The genius of this system is that it doesn't require conspirators. It requires methodology. And methodology, once established and institutionalized, becomes invisible to those who practice it. But let's get back to the maps themselves, because the physical evidence is harder to dismiss than institutional explanations. Maps are expensive to produce. In the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, creating detailed cartographic works required substantial capital, access to source materials, approval from governments or wealthy patrons, and distribution networks. Mapmakers didn't just draw whatever they imagined. They compiled information from multiple sources: travel accounts, diplomatic missions, merchant reports, military reconnaissance, earlier maps. The process was laborious and costly. So when major cartographic houses, Ortelius, Mercator, Hondius, Bliu de L'Isle, all consistently showed Tartary across multiple editions of their atlases, spanning decades and even centuries, this represented accumulated knowledge. Expensive, carefully compiled knowledge. These weren't marginal notations about legendary lands. These were formal geographic designations taking up significant map real estate, complete with internal subdivisions, capital cities, and geographic features. The Library of Congress holds hundreds of these maps. The Russian Geographical Society maintains an extensive collection. So does the British Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, Harvard's map collection. The physical evidence hasn't disappeared. It's sitting in archives, available for examination. What's disappeared is the framework for interpreting that evidence, the questions that should be asked, the contradictions that should be investigated, the patterns that should be noticed. For instance, if Tartary was merely a term of ignorance, a catch-all for unknown territories, why did it persist for so long among cartographers who had access to increasingly detailed information from those regions? Marco Polo had traveled through Central Asia in the 13th century. His accounts were widely circulated. Jesuit missionaries maintained extensive networks throughout Asia from the 16th century onwards, sending detailed reports back to Europe. Russian expansion into Siberia began in earnest in the 16th century, providing first-hand accounts of the territories and peoples there. By the 18th century, European powers had diplomatic relations with Chinese emperors, trade missions to Mongolia, and military reconnaissance throughout the region. Knowledge was improving, yet Tartary remained on the maps. In fact, as knowledge improved, the maps of Tartary became more detailed, not less. More subdivisions, more specific boundaries, more cities and geographic features. This is the opposite of what should happen if Tartary was merely a term of ignorance. So what changed? The political landscape changed. In the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s, European powers, particularly Russia, completed their territorial conquest of the regions formerly labeled Tartary. The Russian Empire absorbed Siberia, Kazakhstan, parts of Mongolia, Manchuria. British interests expanded into India and Afghanistan. Chinese authority reasserted itself over regions that had been more autonomous. The Ottoman Empire controlled territories to the west. From a geopolitical perspective, there was no longer room on the map for Tartary, not because it never existed, but because it had been conquered, subdivided, and absorbed into other political entities. The term became not inaccurate historically, but inconvenient politically. Maps are political documents. They assert sovereignty. They define borders. They legitimize claims. A map showing Tartary in the 19th century would have been a map that didn't show clear Russian sovereignty over Siberia, Chinese authority over Mongolia, or the proper extent of British imperial interests. So the maps were rewritten. The encyclopedias were revised. The geographic terminology was standardized. And because these revisions served the interests of the powerful, or the governments asserting sovereignty, the banks financing expansion, the industries extracting resources, the changes were coordinated, funded, and institutionalized. Not through conspiracy, through aligned incentives, through the natural behavior of institutions that depend on pleasing the sources of their funding, through the career calculations of academics who understand what research gets published and what research gets buried. But here's what makes this case so perfect for understanding knowledge control. Even after the political reasons for erasing Tartary became obvious, the erasure continued. It deepened. By the 20th century, Tartary had become not just absent from maps, but absent from historical consciousness. Students in universities could study the history of Central Asia without ever encountering serious discussion of how Europeans understood that region for 3 centuries. The term became a punchline, a symbol of European ignorance, an embarrassing artifact of pre-scientific geography. This is the final stage of knowledge control, not just removing something from current discourse, but retroactively delegitimizing all historical references to it, making the past sources themselves seem unreliable, confused products of ignorance, creating a narrative where modern knowledge is simply better, clearer, more accurate than what came before, so there's no need to seriously engage with those earlier sources. And this is where the infrastructure of control reveals itself most clearly. Because you can't accomplish this level of historical revision without controlling the universities that train historians and geographers, determining which methodologies are legitimate and which are fringe, the publishing houses that decide which historical research gets printed and distributed, and which manuscripts get rejected as insufficiently rigorous or too speculative, the museums and libraries that preserve original sources, deciding which documents are accessible to researchers and which require special permissions or remain in restricted collections, the funding bodies that determine which research projects receive grants and which researchers can afford to pursue their work, the peer review systems that gatekeep academic journals, ensuring that only articles meeting approved standards of evidence and interpretation get published, the textbook committees that decide what history gets taught in schools, shaping how millions of students first encounter the past. None of this happens through explicit conspiracy. It happens through the quiet accumulation of institutional power, through foundations established by industrial and banking families that continue to fund research and education decades or even centuries after their founders die, through the slow transformation of intellectual institutions into self-perpetuating systems that define expertise, set standards, and exclude challenges to their own authority. And what makes this particularly effective is that most people operating within these systems are genuinely committed to truth, accuracy, and intellectual integrity. They're not cynical. They're not corrupt. They simply accept the methodological frameworks they were trained in, trust the peer review systems they navigate, and believe the institutional hierarchies that determine whose knowledge counts. The system doesn't need conspirators, it needs true believers, and it produces them with remarkable efficiency. But let's return to that 1771 Encyclopedia Britannica entry for Tartary, because there's something specific there that reveals the mechanism of erasure in action. The 1771 entry describes Tartary as the largest country in the world, exceeding Europe in size, dividing it into distinct regions with their own characteristics. It discusses the peoples, the geography, the political divisions. It's straightforward, factual in tone, treating Tartary as a known entity requiring description, not speculation. Now jump to the 1911 Britannica. The entry is now Tatars, not Tartary. It begins by explaining that the term Tartar is less correct than Tatar, immediately establishing that previous usage was mistaken. It describes Tatars as ethnic groups, remnants of Mongol invasions, scattered across Russia and Siberia. It explicitly states that the name was extended to include various Turkish peoples and even the bulk of the inhabitants of the high plateau of Asia and its NW slopes, described under the general name of Tartary. Notice the framing. Tartary has become a misnomer, a mistake, an overgeneralization. The entry acknowledges that the term was once widely used but frames that usage as error, confusion, the product of limited knowledge. By 1911, educated readers are being taught not just that Tartary no longer exists, but that it never properly existed in the first place. It was always just a misunderstanding. This is active historical revision masquerading as clarification, and the 1911 entry was written by Peter Kropotkin, a Russian geographer and anarchist revolutionary, not exactly a tool of imperial power. Yet even Kropotkin, writing with genuine scholarly intent, was working within a framework that had already established Tartary as a historical error. He couldn't see the framework. He could only work within it. This is how knowledge control operates most effectively, not through censorship, not through burning books or suppressing information, through framework control, through establishing the methodological and conceptual boundaries within which acceptable knowledge can be produced, through creating systems where even the most well-intentioned scholars naturally arrive at approved conclusions. Now, we need to talk about what was actually lost when Tartary disappeared from the maps. And this is where things get uncomfortable, because the answer isn't certain. It can't be certain. That's the point of erasure, to create uncertainty, to make the past ambiguous, to ensure that what once existed can only be glimpsed through fragments and inference. What was Tartary? A unified empire like Rome or China, a loose confederation of tribes and khanates, a geographic region with distinct cultural characteristics but no centralized political authority. The sources don't give us a clear answer. And the sources don't give us a clear answer because the sources that might have clarified this question were never preserved, never translated, never made accessible to researchers who might have pursued the question. What we know is that European cartographers and encyclopedists for 3 centuries treated Tartary as significant enough to map, to subdivide, to describe in geographic and ethnographic detail. We know that diplomatic missions were sent there, that trade routes crossed it, that it had capitals and rulers that Europeans recognized. We also know that the peoples living in those regions, various Turkic groups, Mongols and others, likely didn't call themselves Tartarians. The name was European, probably derived from Tatar, with the addition of an extra R to evoke Tartarus, the hell-like underworld of Greek mythology. Europeans both feared and misunderstood the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, and that fear shaped how they conceptualized the vast regions those invaders came from. So was Tartary real? That depends on what you mean by real. Was there a unified empire called Tartary that governed all of northern Asia? Probably not, at least not in the way we think of empires like Rome or China. Was there a distinct geographic and cultural region that Europeans consistently identified as Tartary for 300 years? Absolutely. Did that region have political structures, trade networks, and cultural characteristics that distinguished it from surrounding areas? The evidence suggests yes. But we can't know for certain because the systematic erasure of Tartary from maps and encyclopedias wasn't accompanied by rigorous historical documentation of what actually existed in those regions. The term was simply removed, replaced by other designations, Siberia, Mongolia, Manchuria, that emphasized European and Chinese political control rather than indigenous political organization. And this, ultimately, is what makes the case of Tartary so instructive. The erasure happened in plain sight. The maps are still there in archives. The early encyclopedia entries can still be read. The scholarly apparatus that accomplished the erasure is documented in foundation grants, university endowments, publishing records. None of it is secret. None of it is hidden. Yet it might as well be hidden, because the framework for understanding what happened, the questions that would need to be asked, the patterns that would need to be recognized, has been carefully excluded from standard historical methodology. Asking those questions marks you as unserious, as a conspiracy theorist, as someone who doesn't understand how academic history works. The control isn't over the information. The control is over the framework for interpreting information, over who gets to decide which questions are legitimate, over what counts as evidence and what counts as speculation, over which sources are reliable and which are products of ignorance. Control the framework and you don't need to burn books. They'll sit unread in archives. You don't need to suppress questions. They'll go unasked. You don't need to enforce orthodoxy through threats. It will emerge naturally from the career incentives of academics, the funding priorities of institutions, the peer review systems of journals. This is the architecture of historical knowledge in its most sophisticated form. And once you see it operating in the case of Tartary, you start seeing it everywhere. In every historical debate where certain questions are off-limits, in every field where certain methodologies are dismissed as illegitimate, in every institution where asking the wrong questions can end a career. The maps were rewritten, not once but continuously. Every generation of historians, geographers, and cartographers inherits a framework for understanding the past. And that framework, more than any single fact or interpretation, determines what they can see and what remains invisible. Tartary is gone from the maps, but the mechanism that erased it is still very much present, still operating, still determining what we remember and what we forget, still deciding which pasts are legitimate and which are dismissed as myths. The question isn't really about Tartary. The question is about power. Who decides what we know about the past? Who benefits from those decisions? And what are we prevented from knowing as a result? I don't have complete answers. Nobody does. That's the nature of historical erasure. It creates uncertainty, gaps, silences that can't be filled because the sources that might fill them were never preserved or were actively suppressed. But I can tell you this. The next time someone confidently explains that historical consensus represents the best available knowledge, assembled by rigorous scholars using reliable methods, remember the maps. Remember that for 300 years, the finest cartographers in Europe consistently showed Tartary. Remember that encyclopedias treated it as real. Remember that it didn't fade away gradually as knowledge improved. It was systematically removed within a narrow time window. Remember that the removal coincided with the consolidation of European imperial power over those exact regions. Remember that the families funding universities and encyclopedias were the same families financing imperial expansion and resource extraction. Remember that the scholars who tell you Tartary was never real are working within institutions built by that same power, trained in methodologies established by that same power, publishing in journals funded by that same power. And remember that pointing this out, asking these questions, marking these patterns, will be dismissed as conspiracy thinking, as if coordinated power operating through institutions to serve its interests is somehow unthinkable, as if the wealthy and powerful throughout history haven't always worked to ensure that knowledge serves their interests rather than threatening them. The maps were rewritten, the past was revised, the questions were foreclosed, and most remarkably of all, the system that accomplished this has convinced us that it's serving truth when it's actually serving power. Tartary is gone, but the lesson of its erasure remains, waiting for anyone willing to look at the maps, compare the editions, trace the funding, and ask the question nobody wants asked. Who decides what we remember? And what else have we been made to forget? Let me show you how the system operates in practice. In 1944, the Soviet Union's Central Committee ordered the Tartar Provincial Committee to proceed with a scientific revision of the history of Tartaria. This is documented in CIA reports from 1957. Even after decades of cartographic revision, there remained a living memory among Tatar peoples of something larger, something threatening enough to require systematic historical revision. The Soviets understood what all systems of power eventually learn. Military conquest is only the first step. Real consolidation of power requires control over memory itself. You must erase not just the political entity, but the very concept that such an entity was possible. This is why encyclopedias in the 20th century didn't just update their entries. They retroactively delegitimized all previous entries as products of ignorance. The past itself had to be rewritten to make the present seem inevitable. This brings us to an uncomfortable truth about historical knowledge. We think of history as accumulation, each generation learning more. But power requires selective forgetting. Certain questions must go unasked. Certain sources remain inaccessible. Certain interpretations become professionally dangerous. The disappearance of Tartary demonstrates this perfectly. We have more sources now than ever, more maps digitized, more translation capabilities. Yet the framework for understanding Tartary has narrowed, not expanded. Questions about why it appeared so consistently on maps for 3 centuries, then vanished, go unasked in academic settings. The economic and political interests driving its removal go unexamined. Why? Because examining them would require questioning fundamental assumptions about how historical knowledge is produced. It would require acknowledging that institutional power shapes what we know, that funding sources influence conclusions, that methodologies we treat as neutral are laden with assumptions that serve certain interests and obscure others. Let's look at a specific example. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. 27 million visitors came to see the White City, massive neoclassical buildings showcasing American power. These were marvels of Beaux Arts architecture built in astonishingly short timeframes. The official narrative says they were temporary structures, mostly demolished afterward. But many became permanent civic buildings. The Palace of Fine Arts still stands as the Museum of Science and Industry. Several state buildings were moved to other locations where they remain. The techniques used, the scale, sophistication, engineering raised questions then that remain unanswered now. How does this connect to Tartary? The same pattern appears. Architectural evidence suggesting capabilities beyond official timelines. Official explanations becoming strained under examination. Coordination of narrative across institutions. And defensive posture among experts when questions are raised, not engaging with evidence, but dismissing the questioner. The 1893 buildings were documented. We have photographs, architectural plans, construction records. Yet questions about actual techniques, construction timeline, engineering capabilities, these get deflected with vague references to staff and temporary methods that somehow produce structures stable enough to become permanent museums. With Tartary we have maps, encyclopedia entries, travel accounts, yet questions about actual political structures, indigenous organization, What happened as European powers conquered the region? These get deflected with vague references to geographic terms and European ignorance. The pattern is identical. Physical evidence not quite fitting official narrative. Official explanations glossing over contradictions. Institutional coordination maintaining approved interpretation. Professional consequences for pushing too hard on questions. This is how knowledge control works in open societies. You don't need totalitarian censorship. You need credentialing systems that determine who's qualified to speak authoritatively about the past. You need funding mechanisms that reward certain kinds of research and starve others. You need peer review systems that enforce methodological orthodoxy. You need publishing houses that understand what sells to institutions and what doesn't. You need textbook committees that determine what children learn about history before they develop the critical skills to question it. And perhaps most importantly, you need true believers, scholars who genuinely trust the system, who have built their careers within it, who have internalized its methodologies and can't see them as anything other than neutral tools for discovering truth. These scholars become the system's most effective defenders precisely because they're not cynical. They're not corrupt. They simply can't imagine that the institutions they trust might serve interests other than truth. This is why pointing out the coordinated erasure of Tartary meets such resistance. You're not just challenging a historical interpretation. You're challenging the legitimacy of the entire apparatus that produces historical knowledge. You're suggesting that universities, encyclopedias, publishing houses, all the institutions we trust to tell us about the past, might systematically serve power rather than truth. That suggestion is intolerable to people who have devoted their lives to these institutions. It threatens their professional identity. It undermines their work's value, so they respond defensively. They dismiss questions. They attack questioners' credentials. They invoke institutional consensus. Everything except actually engage with the evidence and address contradictions directly. Consider this. Numerous 17th-century European travelers sent detailed reports about territories we now call Central Asia and Siberia. Some survive in archives, the Library of Congress, British Library, Russian collections, but few were systematically translated, published, or made widely accessible to scholars. This isn't accidental neglect. Archives make choices about what to preserve, catalog, digitize, translate, choices shaped by scholarly demand, shaped by funding priorities, shaped by the interests of those who fund research institutions. If nobody's asking questions about Tartary, archives don't prioritize those sources. If they're not accessible, new scholars don't encounter them. The cycle perpetuates itself. Knowledge stays hidden through structured neglect. This structured neglect serves power beautifully, because if those sources were accessible, we might develop a much more complex understanding of what political structures existed before European conquest. We might recognize that indigenous peoples had sophisticated organization that didn't fit European models. We might question whether European expansion was actually progress for the people living there, or merely progress for European economic interests. Those questions are dangerous. Not to truth, to power. This is the final lesson of Tartary's disappearance from maps. The control isn't just over what happened in the past. It's over what questions we're allowed to ask about the past. It's over which sources count as legitimate. It's over who gets to speak authoritatively about historical truth. It's over the very framework within which historical knowledge is produced and validated. And that control is invisible to most people, including historians, because it operates through institutions presenting themselves as neutral, objective, dedicated to truth. Universities don't announce they serve power, they proclaim academic freedom. Funding bodies don't say they're shaping knowledge, they emphasize rigorous peer review. Publishers don't admit gatekeeping, they stress quality and accuracy. But follow the money, trace the funding, map institutional connections, notice who sits on which boards, track which research gets funded and which gets ignored. The pattern reveals itself through the normal operation of institutions that depend on pleasing those who fund them. The maps were rewritten, Tartary disappeared, and the system that accomplished this is still operating, serving the same interests, ensuring certain questions don't get asked. But here's what they can't erase: the maps themselves. They sit in archives, testimony to what was once known. Early encyclopedias remain, showing what was once documented. The pattern of revision can be traced, showing coordination where there should have been diversity. The evidence exists. What's been erased is the framework for asking the right questions, the curiosity to notice contradictions, the courage to pursue questions that threaten institutional authority, the imagination to conceive that our knowledge production systems might be less objective than they claim. Recovering that framework means rebuilding curiosity, finding courage, reclaiming imagination. Not proving what Tartary was, not establishing alternative narratives, but questioning the authority of approved narratives, demanding access to sources, insisting contradictions be addressed rather than dismissed, refusing to accept institutional consensus as substitute for evidence. The maps were rewritten, but the old maps remain. The question is whether we have courage to look at them seriously, to ask why they showed what they showed, to investigate why that knowledge was systematically removed, to demand better answers than Europeans were just ignorant. Because once you ask these questions about Tartary, you notice the pattern everywhere. In every field where certain questions are professionally dangerous, in every archive where documents remain mysteriously uncatalogued, in every institution where funding depends on approved conclusions, in every textbook presenting one narrative as simple truth while ignoring complicating evidence. The control over historical knowledge is real. It operates through institutions we trust. It's maintained by people who believe they're serving truth. And it ensures certain pasts remain forgotten, certain alternatives unimaginable, certain questions unasked. The investigation continues. The maps sit in archives, silent testimony to what once appeared there and what has since vanished. And somewhere in those silences, in those carefully managed gaps, the truth still waits. Not comfortable, not convenient, but real. Welcome to the other side of cartography. The side that asks who draws the maps and why. The side that knows every map is a choice about what to show and what to hide. The side that remembers what was deliberately forgotten. It's not comfortable here, but it's honest, and in the end, that might be all that matters.